Hi, good evening, and welcome to this evening's interaction with one of the most well-known internet personalities, Vint Cerf, who's Vice President and Chief Evangelist at Google. And being true to his profession, he has asked me to tell you to Google him for his long CV and bio. But I can just point out a few of his salient features, which one, obviously, many of us know that he, along with Robert Kahn, is recognized as the father of the internet. He created, devised the TCP/IP protocol. For his efforts in 1997, he was given the National Medal of Technology by Clinton, and then in 2005, President Bush awarded him the Medal of Freedom, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor in the United States. He has worked with the DoD, DARPA, where he was part of the team that created much of what we take for granted today as we log in and log out. And in 2001, he was appointed as chairperson of the board of ICANN. And he's been the founding president of the Internet Society. The rest of it is on Wikipedia, but still Google him, because this is where this is what his visiting card reads these days. Chetan will be joining us in a while. We have with us present in this room, Vint, people from government, people who are working in the sector. Mr. Govind heads the NIXI, the Internet Exchange. Mr. Gulshan is the man who firefights all the problems of Indian computers. Mr. Saurabh Kumar is with the National Security Council Secretariat, and Mr. Bajaj will interject later with some of his views on data and data security and issues around that. We have Mr. Joshi and many others in the panel who you will get to meet over the cocktails and dinner later. But and some of them are on the way, and I believe they'll be joining us as the evening proceeds. So at this point, I think a 1-minute plug for Observer Research Foundation, where I work. We are a 25-year-old think tank which basically engages with public policy. We cover everything other than Bollywood in our portfolio of work. So movies and culture is strictly an area we don't get into, although I'm sure with Mahima's help we'll be getting there as well. But cyber and cyber policy and internet governance is something that has now engaged us for over 2 years. And in the last 2 years, we've been able to create a platform where we had the privilege of having a video feed from you in October 2014, a forum where we are able to bring together some of the finest minds in India and abroad to discuss and debate cybersecurity and internet governance in India. It is not meant to be an Indian debate, it is meant to be a global debate located in India. And this time we had 55 speakers from 16 countries. Wow. Who spoke at this particular event, and it lasted 2.5 days, had the participation of over 400 participants. And hopefully we believe this is something that will galvanize far deeper and wider debates on this subject in India. Having you here is clearly a part of that process. We need to hear from you, we need to hear from people like you. Your views, you probably would also have a pushback. Indians love to push back, so you will get some of our thoughts as well, and to carry back with you and think about how do you engage with this kind of a constituency, which is going to probably become the largest internet constituency in the days ahead. I will just, before I turn it over to you, probably point out 3 or 4 debates that are taking place today in the country, and we'll hear more about them from each of the experts who are in this room. I think the first clearly is the loudest one in terms of international conversations, which is the whole debate between state and multi-stakeholder. Is it a multilateral conversation? Is it a multi-stakeholder conversation? Which is who's the best interlocutor? Which are the institutions and organizations that are best placed to serve various aspects of managing what is not a global common, but certainly a common with attributes of universality. And how do you manage that in this particular world? That's one debate that's clearly playing out in India, and with the new government now in Delhi since October, it's something they will need to respond to in the days ahead. The second debate, I think, in India, which is now beginning to kind of get into a certain acquire certain gravitas, is on the balance between security and human freedom. And I think that's the free speech, privacy, and at the same time balancing interests around security, radicalization, etc. And how do you manage these two competing demands? Where is the golden median? How do you balance it? The third debate, obviously, is around sovereignty and jurisdiction. And can we devise ways and means in which digitally quasi-sovereignty can be apportioned to packets as they move across borders? If that is one challenge, the second is how do you protect territoriality and jurisdiction on packets stored in an external location which belong to a different third country? Mm-hmm. How do you apportion jurisdiction there? So these are some of the issues around jurisdiction and sovereignty which at some point will certainly become important, and the debates around data localization, data chauvinism, data nationalism, etc., are all basically byproducts of insecurity when it comes to that. The fourth, obviously, which is the most compelling debate in India, which this Indian government has put on the center stage, is clearly the mission to connect every Indian to the internet. And I think securing access to everyone is the first security, is the first aspect of any architecture that must be created, which means pricing policies, which means regulatory policies, which means intellectual property regimes, which means looking the other way to allow certain proliferation of content and adoption of habits. So how do you create that ecosystem while at the same time engage with first world norms? And how do you find the balance there again? And I think these are 3 or 4 crucial conversations that we are having in this country, and certainly many others which I have not been able to list here. But with that, let me turn it over to Vint Cerf, who will speak on the theme this evening, the future of the internet. And I believe you might be focusing a bit on the Internet of Things and certainly around data as well. So over to you, Vint, and this is your mic.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with you. I feel compelled to point out that you're about to prove my favorite theorem, which is number 208. And this theorem reads, if you feed them, they will come. And here you are, and we do intend to feed you. So there's another theorem, though, 206, and it reads, everything is more complicated. And I think I have found that the closer you look at almost anything, the more complicated it tends to get. Whether it's biological phenomena or cosmology or figuring out how to make internet accessible to everyone in the world. So you're no exception to that. In fact, this dialogue is important not for what I have to say, but for what you have to say to each other. You have an opportunity to create and to enable things to happen in India that would not happen unless everyone had access to this facility. The vision that Google has is expressed in our motto, which says to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And the idea that we could allow every person on the planet to get access to information at will is one which I find absolutely compelling. And I'd like to give you a little anecdote to show you how deeply this has penetrated my own personal life. Believe it or not, occasionally we have power outages in the US. And I experienced one a few months ago, and it was lengthy. It was for pretty much a good day, and I had some writing assignments that I needed to do. And I thought, well, I can get a pen and paper and I can write this out in longhand. I couldn't do it. It's not that I had forgotten how to write. It's that when I wanted to write something down, I would get halfway through the sentence and a question would come in my mind about a particular fact or something that I would normally have looked up on Google, except I couldn't. My laptop was working, but the Wi-Fi wasn't available. And I found it very hard to compose without having immediate access to information. And that taught me a lesson that once you get accustomed to this convenience, it's very hard to go back. And I think we're all experiencing the same thing with our smartphones. Once you have a smartphone and once you have applications that you find useful, it's very hard to do without them. We rapidly become accustomed to that. So this enabling effect, I think, is very important, not only for the sheer value of getting access to information, but because it also enables potential new businesses to form. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about the internet and jobs and how information technology can create jobs. You've already had at least 2 decades of really valuable experience creating jobs based on information technology. Sam Petroda is a good friend of mine, and I suspect you know him just as well. And he's been a huge proponent of investment in this space, and I think it's paid off. You have made a real and visible global mark by showing this country's ability to respond to information technology needs outside of India. This raises a very interesting observation from my point of view, that in spite of the relatively light penetration as of now of internet services, you were able to serve other parts of the world that needed the products that your programmers can make. So you've actually taken advantage of other places' penetration of internet and information technology and turned that into a business opportunity. Of course, having done that, it's natural that you would want to make those same products and services useful to the people who live in this country. And that's part of what is going on. I was very pleased to learn about the 2010 initiative, which is still going on, to get internet connectivity to all of the 600,000 villages in the country, in addition, of course, to the major cities. It's a huge undertaking. But it's one that the rest of the world is going to be watching. If you solve this problem, there are many other parts of the world that will benefit from your experience. I was very excited when I heard about the Australian initiative as well, which is evidence of a country that decided it was going to make a national investment in infrastructure for the benefit of its citizens. And of course, it's still underway there. We don't see the complete outcome yet. But you have an opportunity to do something very similar. And I have great respect for the ambition and for the potential that you bring. This brings up a couple of points that I think are worth considering. One of them is, how open is the internet? How easy is it to get access to it, to use it, and to build products and services on top of that infrastructure? When the design was first being done, literally over 40 years ago, our objective was to make it possible for any computer on any network to communicate with any other computer on any other network, as long as they all met some of the standards that the internet relies on, one of which is basically packet switching. You might be amused to discover that the original work in packet switching was sponsored by the American Defense Department, but it had nothing to do with specific defense applications. The organization that I worked for was called the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and in it there was an Information Processing Techniques Office. We were sponsoring research in artificial intelligence and computer science at about a dozen universities in the US, ones that you would recognize: Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, MIT, and so on. And every year, this is back in the early 1970s and late 60s, every year each of the computer science departments would ask for the latest world-class computer, because without it they couldn't do world-class research. And even the Defense Department couldn't afford to buy a new computer for each computer science department that it was sponsoring research at. So they said, we're going to build a network and you're going to share. So we built the ARPANET. And indeed, they did share, and it had two effects. One of them was that they were able to build on each other's research more readily. They had access to the other party's programs, software, and we assured all of them that we would fund all of them, so they weren't competing with each other for support for the research, which meant they were much more comfortable sharing their results. And the consequence of that was a much more rapid progress in the research areas that these dozen universities were engaging in. So the success of the implementation of the ARPANET led us to think about using computers. Now remember, it's the Defense Department, so we were thinking, what about command and control? Is it possible that we could use computers to manage our resources better than we could without them? So the theory was that if you had computers at work managing resources in a command and control environment, that a smaller team could overcome a larger one simply by managing its resources better. And so we decided that we should look into this. And then we realized that if you were going to do this, you would have to put the computers in airplanes and ships at sea and ground mobile vehicles. Well, we built the ARPANET based on dedicated telephone circuits. And it didn't look like you could connect the tanks and the ships with wires, because they would get tangled up and the tanks would run over the wires and break them. So we had to develop packet radio and packet satellite in order to support these other applications. Well, the result of those two networks is they were all packet switched, but they were different. They ran at different speeds. You had different delays depending on, for example, a synchronous satellite. You had different error rates, different packet sizes. And so in 1973, my partner, Bob Kahn, who had worked on the ARPANET, as did I, came to my laboratory at Stanford and said, "Oh, we have a problem." I said, "Yeah, what's the problem?" He said, "Well, how are we going to connect these different nets to each other?" That was the internet problem. That problem got solved in about 6 months. And we published a paper in May of 1974 that described for the first time what the internet would look like without calling it internet, because we didn't know that's what it was supposed to be called. By December of 1974, we had published the first TCP specification. It was in RFC 675. And I hope you'll be pleased to know that there were three names on that paper. My name, another student named Carl Sunshine, and one of my best students, Yogan Dalal. Yogan was from Delhi. He went to the US, did his graduate work at Stanford University, and then stayed there, eventually became a venture capitalist. And so Yogan has contributed to the American GDP. What we need is more Yogans contributing to the Indian GDP. And so part of our story tonight, I think, needs to be ways in which entrepreneurs can be enabled. How do we find capital for them? How do we make sure that they can create new businesses? How can we make it okay to fail? And I know this sounds like a kind of dismal idea, but I can tell you that the freedom to fail also creates the freedom to take risk and to try out ideas that you might otherwise not be willing to try. At Google, we are given that freedom. And one of the reasons that it has allowed us to be a very innovative company is that we recognize that not everything we try to do is going to work. And we accept the possibility that we will fail at some of our efforts. Larry Page, who's the CEO, insists that we shoot as high as possible in the targets that we are attempting. I think his view is that if you fail and you don't make it to that high target, you may actually make it pretty high up anyway. And he would rather do that than have us shoot for some small incremental improvement in something. But the freedom to fail, I think, is really essential. Now, you don't want to fail all the time, and you certainly want to learn from your failures. But this turns out to be a notion which is not comfortable in all cultures. In the time that I have spent in Europe, I've learned that failure there is very difficult to overcome. That if you have a business that doesn't succeed, it's very hard to come back again and say to funding sources, often the banks, that I know my previous company didn't work, but I want to try again. And they'll say, you're a business failure, you should go away. The Silicon Valley is very different in that regard. I'd also like to make another observation, which I don't know if it proves my point, but it's a realization that has given me great respect for my Indian colleagues. So many of them have come to the United States and created successful businesses in the Silicon Valley. There's no question in my mind you have more than enough ample creativity, innovation, intelligence, and education and training to be able to build successful businesses. But there's something interesting that happens when we bring your colleagues to the US. The environment there somehow allows them to try these ideas out, and when they fail, they get to start again. You probably heard of a company called Waze, W-A-Z-E. It's a crowdsourcing system that helps people figure out where the congestion is on the roads. We acquired the company from a group in Israel a couple of years ago. What was interesting is that last year I attended a conference at which the founder of Waze was speaking. And he told the other entrepreneurs who were in the room that he had started 3 other companies that failed. And he wanted to let them know that it wasn't fatal and that he was able to start later a more successful company. The other thing which is important is that sometimes business conditions change, and it has nothing to do, it's not your fault. It's just that the business model you may have had has had the rug pulled out from under it. So I don't want to dwell on failure, which sounds so negative, but I think the freedom to fail and to recover and to get up and to be given credit for having tried is a really important ingredient in some of the successful businesses that we see emerging from the Silicon Valley. I know you don't want me to go on, and I know I want to get into some dialogue, but I think internet governance needs to be addressed. I think many of you are aware of something called the Internet Governance Forum, and I don't know if you remember where it came from. In 2003, the International Telecommunication Union sponsored something called the World Summit on the Information Society. And this was a multilateral meeting of government representatives. And the first question that they asked themselves is, what's an information society? And someone, I don't know who, said, well, the internet is kind of like that. And so the first question that they had was, who's in charge of the internet? And when they asked me, I said, well, no one, in fact. It's a highly distributed bottom-up thing. And they didn't believe us. They refused to believe that anything of this magnitude and scale could possibly be a distributed system. So they said, they looked around and they discovered an organization called ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. I happened to have been chairman at the time, and so they decided that ICANN must be in charge of the internet because it was the only aspect of the network that required some central management. And I want to emphasize it's a purely administrative operation. All they do is make sure that when IP addresses are allocated, that they go uniquely to one party and not the same address to 2 parties. So they allocate address space from the Internet Protocol numerical address space. It goes to regional internet registries. In your case, it would go to APNIC, the Asia Pacific Network Information Center. There are 4 other such regional internet registries. The only other thing they do is to manage the root zone of the domain name system. And the only thing they do there is make sure that the top-level domain names point to the correct IP addresses for further resolution. And that's it. It's an administrative operation, that's all. And it's highly distributed because they delegate responsibility for the top-level domains and for IP address management to other parties. So despite this belief that some central organization existed to manage the internet, there are 500,000 networks that make up the internet, and they're all run independently of each other. Some of them are not-for-profit, some of them are for-profit, Some of them are run by governments. They each make their own decisions about which hardware and software to acquire and operate or build. They each make their own decisions about who to interconnect with. So it's a highly distributed environment. The only reason it works is that there are standards that everybody uses. And so this is another element to keep in mind, and that's the importance of standards. And when we get to the Internet of Things, that's going to be a really key element in a successful implementation. So what we have here out of the Internet Governance Forum, the reason that it came about is that after this World Summit got started, they all wondered who was in charge of the Internet. Then they decided they should study this problem, so they had a working group on Internet governance. And they couldn't come to any conclusions, so at the end of the World Summit on the Information Society, they created the Internet Governance Forum, which was a multi-stakeholder place where the technical community, the private sector, governments, and civil society could meet and to discuss issues arising in the operation and implementation of the Internet. That has been a really valuable platform. It doesn't make decisions. Some people don't like that, but what's important about not making decisions is that you get very candid views of what the problems are in the Internet and what the potentials are, because no one is trying to force someone to come up with a final agreement or a statement of some kind. So that governance forum has been a very valuable exercise, and I wanted to draw your attention to something else that has happened as a result. There are regional and national Internet governance fora which have emerged literally out of the ground. It's not sponsored by the United Nations, it's not sponsored by the ITU. It's groups of people, either at national or regional level, interested in the questions associated with Internet's use and implementation, and they voluntarily decided they want to have these meetings to discuss these issues. I couldn't tell you how important that is. There's energy behind those meetings that doesn't require a top-down driver. This is driven from the bottom up. And so I'm a big fan of the governance forums, both the international one that takes place once a year and the others that take place during the rest of the year. And I hope that you're participating in those as well. The multi-stakeholder notion, I think, is a very powerful one. In a way, the ideas kind of came out of our Internet Engineering Task Force. This is a group that does standards making for the Internet. You can't join the group. There's no membership role. All you can do is show up and contribute your ideas. And if your ideas are accepted by others, they may eventually become standards. If they're not, they won't. But this notion of anyone should have an opportunity to sit around the table is part of the theme of multi-stakeholder policy making. Earlier today we had a meeting, some of you were there, and I made the point that there's real value in having the people around the table who will be affected by policy telling you what the effects might be. So you have direct feedback when you're doing policy development from all the stakeholders who might be affected. This doesn't mean that the adopted policy is implemented by all those stakeholders. It could be that it's implemented by a government, it might be implemented by some layer of government, whether it's local, national, or international. So the body which implements and enforces policy may not be a multi-stakeholder body, but the process of developing policy gets value from its a multi-stakeholder process. Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers has tried to implement that. It's had varying degrees of success with it. On the whole, I think it's been pretty successful. So I'm a big fan of this kind of policy development, and I'd like to encourage you to consider that as you work on policies here for government implementation. Maybe we should shift over to two other things, and then maybe we get into some discussion. One of them is intellectual property. Um, I think it's very interesting that when Bob Kahn and I did the original internet design, we actually debated whether we should patent the technology. We discussed it seriously and concluded we should not. And we decided to simply make it public, open it up to anyone who wanted to use it. And I think that was the right decision, because it meant anyone who wanted to build a piece of internet had the rules for doing that. And so we said, basically, if you can figure out how to build the network according to this design, and if you can find somebody to connect to, it should work. And as a consequence, the system just grew very organically, with people, governments and private sector, making investments in implementing pieces of internet and finding someone to connect to. And it's still true today. So there are situations where trying to protect things using intellectual property rules actually inhibits the ability of the system to expand. So that's why I think you hear a lot of open source, and you hear about open technology development, where all parties have an opportunity to contribute. This takes me back to the enabling element of internet and what you are about here. Anything you can do to enable people to exercise their innovation and creativity can be a very powerful GDP enhancing tool. And the mobiles are a good example of that. Once you have smartphones available and you establish a standard application programming interface, the people who are building the applications don't have to know how the mobile phones work. They just have to know how to meet the interface. This is a powerful enabling kind of technique. It's a sort of a layering structure. The internet is just like that. It's a layered architecture. Anything you can do to enable more creativity, to allow lots and lots of experiments to happen, is a really powerful way of expanding the economy. I think of the internet as if it were a kind of big anthill. You know, if you think for a minute about, imagine you've got an anthill in front of you, and you decide one day to follow 2 or 3 ants to see what they do. Probably nothing interesting would happen. But there's 100 million ants. And you can't follow all 100 million ants, but I will bet you that if you could, you would discover at least 1 or 2 or 3 ants would show up with something interesting that they bring back to the anthill. I feel like that every time I open the business pages of the magazines and newspapers that I still read, because somebody always comes up with another application for the internet that I never would have thought of. And so the idea that this is an open platform for experimentation is really powerful. What I find chilling is the possibility that business interests would interfere with the ability to use this platform for exploration. If, for example, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the founders of Google, had to do a business deal with every ISP in the world before they could bring up their product or service, it never would have gotten off the ground. So this notion of sort of universal connectivity, of freedom to interconnect anything to anything else, is sort of at the heart of internet success. And I think you will see the same thing with the Internet of Things. I had a conversation not too long ago with someone who was designing an appliance that was supposed to be internet enabled, and in order to be remotely operated or managed, or to report its status back. And I was listening to this person describing what he was doing, and what really grabbed my attention was not the exact design that he was planning or the application he was planning. It was his casual assumption that this thing could be part of the internet, because that was the easy part. You could buy the chipsets, the protocols were already available. You just needed to put them into the operating system that was going to be used to run this device. This assumption, this casual assumption that anything could be connected to the internet and therefore be able to talk to everything else, is one of the things that makes the potential of the Internet of Things so exciting for me. It leads to smart homes, it leads to smart cars, it leads to maybe someday smart cities. And I think some of you already know this, but there is already a very active smart city international engagement underway. A number of countries have smart city initiatives. In the US, we have a smart grid initiative on the electricity side. This is something that's well worth some of your attention. The idea that a city could be aware of its condition, could report that condition to its citizens, could help those citizens understand how they could make better use of the facilities of the city, including traffic congestion, avoiding it, is a very attractive possibility. And in a period of time where resources are becoming constrained, the non-renewable ones especially, and even theoretically renewable resources like fresh water are still a big issue for us, as you know. So my belief right now is that the openness of the internet and the standards that make it work are just as important for the Internet of Things as they have been for all the previous developments that are on the net. Well, there's lots more to be said, but maybe I should stop there and give you a chance to engage. I'm happy to have this discussion, but I want you to feel free to have a debate among yourselves as well, because even after I go back to the States, you should be talking to each other about these things. So I'll stop there and let's have a discussion.
Thanks, Vint. Don't worry, we have lots of debates here with each other. Today we are going to debate with you. But you know, Dr. Gulshan is here with us. He's the head of the Computer Emergency Response Team, and he has to leave. So I'm going to first bring him in, and maybe, sir, you can share some of your thoughts.
Samir, first of all, I must thank ORF, you and Mahima for giving me opportunity to share dice with Vint Cerf, which all of us know is the father of the internet. I have the privilege to interact with him 1993 when he used to be the consultant in the ERNet. We have the privilege to meet him and know his views there. Since 1993 and 2015, I think he also must be amazed sometime how the internet has taken place, shaped it has taken place. I'm sure he won't have imagined the kind of internet which we are seeing today or in the time when he did it. In fact, I mean, I read somewhere NSF itself has acknowledged that the DARPA project was one of the most valuable projects they ever funded things there. And in that sense, it's really it's a proud and it's a privilege for me that I'm sharing dice with him and many other colleagues who are the leaders and icon in their own views and carry the views. No doubt about it, I share views with Vint has said. The internet today is a global common, which with every aspect of our life is getting impacted there. I think not a day will pass when we will not be accessing the internet or the network several times in a day. We don't really remember how many times in a day we access that. While the DOT figures may say something, but my own estimates are there that 400 million internet connections are there if you include the mobile part aspect also, where we buy a pack of 100 rupees or 200 rupees a month. We do that, it will be certainly more than 400 million numbers have come up. What a change has come up. I mean, when I see my own family, my mother is 80 years old, how she is when interacting on a Skype or a WhatsApp with her grandson here and there. And in fact, she was in a hospital and the doctor came. She was trying to switch off the system there. Doctor said, oh, your grandmother knows she was talking to my thing. So I see what a benefit impact it has brought to each other, the families, things there. But it has given rise its own issues there. No one is saying in the world that the freedom of expression or speech is not important. It's granted. That's why, since everyone is using, they believe in freedom of expression and speech. The issue is only how much balance you have to create in the freedom of expression. In my view, if I am understood clearly, that's the issue. Freedom of speech is not an issue. No government, no society is talking about, because if you have to go on the internet, if you have to use on the internet, freedom of speech is taken granted. That's the first thing is taken granted there. So I don't think there is an issue of freedom of expression. Only issue is how much we have to do. I am dealing with the incident which happened in the area of security in other laws there. So I have the little more knowledge. I mean, many of the people present here in this forum or elsewhere also, little more knowledge there. I find that the issues which are coming up, there are multi-dimensional issues are coming up. There is not a single issue which you can solve in using one technique or one policy. It's not there. It's all multi-dimensional issues are there. Each of the issue concerns the law, each of the issue concerns the technology, and each of the issues concern the policy also, the aspect there. It's a very complex kind of a thing, and that's why we all are debating now the complex issues there. And when I see the incident and I look at it, how the smart cities are going to take place or how the Internet of Things is going to take place, I sometimes wonder whether the country like India, we need to understand. Let us be very frank that we started doing the internet in around 1997 when the policy came up there, 1997. DOT informed the ISP policy, and we used to charge 1 rupee for a license there. But country like US, 1969 when Vint invented the that DARPA thing and the TCP/IP and the internet there. So there is a gap, but then gap is bridging the gap very fast in a country like India also there. I think we need to look at the issues there. I mean, my interaction with the people in this country, yes, there are issues of the governance issues there. There are issues of security issues there. And yes, the many countries in Europe and US are able to resolve those issues there because they have the resources there, most of the companies are located there, and they use the law under which those companies function there. But that could be an issue in many other countries, including India. We need to look at it, how do we address those issues so that everyone plays a role equitably and better. Because if we don't address those issues in a balanced manner there, I'm sure there's going to be these issues will keep on coming in different form, different things there. So there is a high time we address these issues and a wider debate there. I have been, I would say that I have the privilege to participate in this debate of multi-stakeholder, multilateral approach. I would certainly hesitation to say, I need to understand the exact meaning of the multi-stakeholder. This is a society where in anything happens, the government has to come and play a role. I mean, the industry themselves don't resolve. The government, certainly everyone expects government to do the role there. So what is the role the government will play? I'm not saying government should regulate that. Certainly I'm not saying. As a citizen of this country, my views are paramount than what service I do as a part of the government job there. I first look at myself, citizen of this country. What will happen to me if we regulate it? I mean, those are the issues gets more important on the mind because we have seen the benefit of the internet. How do we interact? How do we do? So as a citizen comes more, I'm sure everyone think first as a citizen rather than as a respective role which they are supposed to perform, whether industry or the government. So we need little more clarity that what government should supposed to do, what the industry should supposed to do. In my view, there has to be some sort of a self-control, self-regulation, self-assessment by each of the stakeholders which we are dealing with this. Whether it's a part of the technology or it's a part of the policy or it's part of a regulation, we need to look at it and create a more balanced society there. The issues, security issues there. At times I wonder when the new technology comes up, how the things happens there. Whether I should use the internet or the net for so-and-so application, I don't use the so-and-so application there. You can see that I have a mobile phone. I have not used this for the internet. I have some other phone, a cheaper phone that I use for the internet purposes there because so many doubts in my security issue. I deal with issues. Those issues come in my mind. Immediately issue comes to my mind. So I think most than the incident which are taking place, whether it's a privacy infringement or a security infringement, those issues are also becoming more and more complex. I can quote large number of cases there. Issues become very, very complex there. And certainly it has an infringement or it has impact on the governance issue, more incident, complex issues. It creates a more confusion in our mind how the governance model should take place so that we are able to address these issues in longer time. In my view, I think we need to debate. I know the 2015, there is a deadline that transition takes place, but first of all, are we ready to have a transition in 2015, the time target which has been put there? Are we mature enough to understand all the issues there, or do we that? In my view, I think we need to have a little more time, more wider debate should take place. Everyone is open to consider, because no one wants to go back. No one wants to have any regulation, certainly not. But they want to assure, because so many apprehension comes up there, and I think they need to have a little larger debate. It will take some time to get more maturity. We took so much time to go to this level of access to internet or technology. Certainly we do that. We buy a new phone, we take some time to become accustomed to that, or use free with the using that kind of technology there. I think the issues are very important, and the security issues are gaining more and more importance. In fact, when we talk about the physical layer or the content layer or the other software layer, the security becomes a fourth layer, becomes very, very important kind of a layer there. Where the issues, I mean, I am with Vint, and I think, but we need more debate, more understanding, and we look forward more from Vint, because I know him now so long there, and whatever Vint, wherever Vint will be there, he certainly cannot modulate with respect to that organization, with the forum there. His genuine interest, he's the father of the internet, that will get reflected some of the way, and certainly I'm looking for those in touching point from him that gives us a light to proceed further in a constructive manner. Thank you, Samir, for giving me an opportunity. Thank you, Vint, for.
Since he has to leave,
Yeah.
would you like to just respond to him?
Yes. Well, first of all, let me tell you something about being called the father of the internet. If you have any children, you know that the first thing you want to do is not take too much credit for when they do well, so you don't have to take too much blame when they mess up. So, you know, lots of other people have had their fingers in the internet pie. I'm just glad that it was a kind of technology that lots of people could contribute to. And I want to emphasize, as I did to the students at IIT in Mumbai yesterday, the internet is still evolving. It is willing to accept new ideas. It is ready to change and to adapt and to allow the creation of new kinds of functionalities. I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, even though the design is 40 years old. I like very much the things that you had to say. You mentioned security, and I've discovered that this word causes people to think in very particular ways, and sometimes, you know, national security comes to mind. And I realized after engaging in conversations like this all around the world that safety might be a more important term to think about. People who are using the internet want to feel and be safe using it. And, you know, we would be dishonest if we didn't admit that there are people out there who don't have everyone's best interests at heart. I mean, this is what happens when you go from the geek community that developed the internet. We were just a bunch of engineers. We didn't have any interest in wrecking each other's work. And then you turn it loose in the general public, and you get the bad guys as well as the good guys. So the reason safety has gotten so interesting to me is that I keep thinking about fire departments. Let me try to relate these. You know, when your house is on fire, you don't call the police department. You call the fire department. And I have this image in my head. Your house is on fire, and you're standing there with a garden hose, and you realize, I need somebody with a bigger hose and more water. So you call the fire department, and they come, and their job is to put out the fire. After the fire has been put out, then they try to figure out how did the fire start. And if it looks like it's arson because somebody started the fire on purpose, then they call the police department. But we should think about this, because there are small businesses that don't have the capacity to respond and to protect themselves from various kinds of attack and malware and everything else. Maybe we need a cyber fire department. And I've actually proposed that officially in the United States, and there's some interest in trying this out. There are all these companies that are sometimes harmed, or even citizens. When we get to the Internet of Things, safety is even more important, because we don't want the devices that we rely on day to day to malfunction. So I would encourage that vocabulary as you start thinking about how to respond to our concerns about the uses and the abuses of the internet. This leads me to one other observation, and that's education. And there are two aspects of this. One of them is helping people to understand how to use the internet in a safe way. Just like we tell children, you know, don't get into the car with strangers or don't cross the street without looking on either side. We should help people understand what safe behavior is like in the net. And it takes some sophistication. When you get an email and it looks interesting and you just click on it without realizing if I click on something that I don't know where it came from, it may have an attachment that will, you know, put malware on my machine. We have to help people understand that that's a risk. And it's just part of a realistic understanding of the internet environment. We can't make it perfect. We can't make it absolutely safe. And so people have to be thoughtful and have to be taught how to make use of the net. On the research side, there are big opportunities. The reason that we have unsafe systems is that we have bugs in our software. I haven't met any programmers that will stand up and guarantee to write you a piece of software that has no bugs. And the fact that you haven't found the bug doesn't mean it isn't there, it just means you haven't found it yet. So the design and implementation of operating systems and applications deserves some serious research attention. It's embarrassing. I have a PhD in computer science. I used to make my living writing code. People write software in 2015 the same way they wrote software in 1965, 50 years ago. It has not improved very much compared to the improvement of performance of hardware. And so, you know, my computer engineering friends sort of laugh at the software people, that includes me, and say, you haven't done anything compared to what we've done. And it's true. So given that you have lots of smart engineers here, maybe you should be thinking your way through how to design and build operating systems, browsers, and other applications that are a lot more paranoid about safety. I've been telling my colleagues that I tried to get our marketing department to change the name of our Android operating system to Paranoid because, you know, it would convey the idea that it was very concerned about safety. But they thought that wasn't going to be a very good marketing brand, so we didn't do that. So not to rattle on too much, on the education side, one other observation. If we face education problems in India, and we do, the internet and access to it is a potential way for getting better educated citizens. This notion of massive online open courses has become not just a meme, but it's actually becoming reality. And in some of the most unexpected places, there is a deep interest in this notion of multi-access massive online open courses, MOOCs. The person that surprised me the most about this idea is the president of Stanford University, John Hennessy. John was literally jumping up and down about his excitement at this technology. I can say that two of my colleagues at Google were among the first to try this idea out, except they didn't know that that's what they were doing. They offered a class, this is probably 5 years ago now, an online class in artificial intelligence. And they thought 500 people might sign up for this class. 160,000 people signed up for the class because it was being offered online on the net. And of course there was a brief pause, and when they said, we're going to have to rewrite all the software to deal with the scaling of all this. But they did it. And John Hennessy, I said, why are you so excited about MOOCs, John? You charge $50,000 a year for a degree from Stanford University. Why is a MOOC of interest? And he said, you didn't do the math. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, imagine that you have a class of 100,000 people. And suppose that they each paid $10 for the class. If you do the arithmetic, it's a $1 million class. That's a lot of rupees. And I don't know very many professors who have taught $1 million classes. But I can guarantee you there's a lot of competition out there that would be interested in doing that. You can do a lot with $1 million. You can hire graduate students, teaching assistants, you can organize. If it's all over the world, you can have people located in places where the students can get together and talk to each other. So you can build quite a large enterprise out of this online coursework at a very low cost per person. It's the scaling that makes the difference. But something else has happened at Stanford that I had not anticipated. It's called the flipping of the classroom. So the students are told, go watch the MOOC, go watch the videos. You can watch them as many times as you like. The professor doesn't have to keep repeating himself or herself. And then when you come into the classroom, we're going to learn how to solve problems based on what you've learned from watching and participating in the MOOC. Well, I discovered that writing a MOOC is not as easy as it sounds. This is not just getting up and lecturing. Not only do you have to prepare material, but you have to figure out how to break it into maybe 15-minute segments. And after you've done that, you have to figure out, how do I figure out whether the student actually understood what I said? So now you have to have tests that are built into the MOOC. Then you have to figure out what to do when you discover the student didn't understand the material. So now you have to figure out what is the remedial video material you have to prepare in order to deal with the student who got the wrong answers. Now, some of you are academics, or you've been in an academic setting. I don't know about you. I've been in academic settings. I used to teach at Stanford, but my favorite situation was me on one side of the table and a student on the other side of the table, asking the student questions to get them to demonstrate that they knew the material. And if they got the wrong answer, my reaction was not, that's a stupid answer. It's, oh, you must have a model in your head that's broken. Let's figure out what's broken about the model and fix that so the next time you'll get the right answer. Doing a good MOOC involves exactly that kind of thing. But you have lots of people that are capable of doing that. So surely this is an opportunity to transform the way education happens, not only in this country, but elsewhere.
What we'll do now is we'll collect actually, you have to leave. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate you.
What we'll do is we'll collect 3 interventions now, and then we'll come back to you again. So I'll first go to Dr. Govind. Maybe you can briefly comment on what your ideas are around the transition, since you are well versed with it.
I would be brief because already, first of all, I would like to thank the ORF and it's always a pleasure to be here with the Dr. Vint Cerf. And I had many interactions with him during the ICANN GAC meetings, where internationalized domain names, which were introduced in the ICANN, the Vint was the first to, see that the roots, how the Puni codes and all those kind of things has been converted and reconverted into the root zone files. And then the IPv6, I think that's another dimension. Yeah, so that's another dimension, which Vint Cerf and where we were very much, interacted in the ICANN meetings and the GAC. My thing is quite different today in the sense that INR transition process is on. The US government is going to be, making arrangement for the names, numbers, and the internet protocols. And our internet coordination group is already working. So what kind of credible organization or the mechanism that is going to come up? Because still it is a lot of ifs and buts, whether after leaving the ICANN or the NTIA leaves this kind of thing, what will be the kind of organizational structure, whether jurisdictional issues and its controlling issues and all those kind of things, whether we have thought about those kind of things. Then this is one aspect. Another aspect is I will go to the root of the internet, like Vint Cerf is the father of the internet, about the 13 root servers. why and when these 13 root servers were designed, why not more? And whether in the global perspective today, when we are all debating about the root servers, why it is within, where only in the US and the Europe, why not, another architecture or some kind of architecture comes where, every country doesn't feel about it's not there with him, The root is such a way it is designed or architecture so that the internet doesn't stop anywhere, which kind of things people are debating in the internet governance forums. And one of the important thing is the how the root works and why not more than 13, why not 100 and those kind of stuffs. So these two I just like to.
We'll collect two more interventions.
Okay, yeah.
We'll come back to this. So I want to now at this time bring in two guests here. One is Arvind Gupta, who heads the BJP IT cell. I'm probably going to ask him to speak a little bit about the digital India from a perspective that he has on where we could be headed this way. He himself has a background in creating businesses and then obviously making a huge amount of money from them. so that's good. And then I'm going to request Aruna ji to come in, and she manages the USOF fund, which is basically going to fund the broadband to the rural and last mile across the Indian geography, which is a big challenge. So I'm going to bring these two in at this time.
Yeah, thank you, Samir. The interesting part is I'm one of the students, if you may call, of Dr. Cert, Vint Cerf, because I was at the UFI, the Illinois NCSA labs, where I learned my programming and where we wrote the first browser, by the way. And you lectured us there, and when we launched the Mosaic browser, basically. So yeah, Samir, the journey from there, I mean, it's all based on TCP/IP and internet, and of course, I think as an entrepreneur and innovator, all of us need to see how we can use it better for governance, for technology, for businesses, for improving the quality of life of people. And I know what Samir you wanted me to comment on, but it's very interesting, Sir, that you talk about things that have been put as a vision statement for the government. Most of the things that that you want to bring out of the internet or the digital economy are part of the digital India vision that that the government is very excited about. In fact, I think last April, online open courses, we were the first one to mention that. We mentioned a huge program on smart cities, and all the smart city experts globally tell us that this is the most ambitious program of its nature. Well, you dream big to achieve, good results. So the government has a very comprehensive digital empowerment, digital literacy program, and that's now called Digital India. It really is the people program to put the Internet of Things, but first put the Internet of people. So to enable people to join the internet, so that Internet of Things and Internet of everything can be achieved, right? So, we can all imagine if 1 billion people join the internet with the literacy and with the improving quality of life and that we are expecting in India. The kind of addition to the world and the global economy, India's GDP and the global economy would be huge. And to enable that, we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about affordable local language access, which is very, very important. We're talking about Make in India, which basically makes the devices and the operating systems and everything more affordable. We're talking about local content, because consumption in India happens in multiple languages, as you of course know. And it's very important for people to be able to learn and consume content as they feel comfortable. So it is it's a multi approach program. It has many pillars, but eventually it wants to give digital empowerment to every single Indian. And the vision is to have by 2020, which is the next 5 years now, a connection, a digital connection to every family, every Indian. And it's a very ambitious program. And you talked about education, as you said. We also envision healthcare. Again, as an additional mechanisms of deploying telemedicine, virtual classrooms, all of it. So, and while we do that, I mean, we also have the ambition to produce the world's biggest experts on cyber security. So cyber security, cyber is very important to this whole thing. We understand the impact once you're more digitally, dependent, if you may call. The importance of cyber and cyber security even becomes much higher. So, a program to build capacity, and Dr. Rai has had to leave, but I mean, we've talked a lot about how do we build capacity in cyber and cyber security, cyber defense, and all the cyber-related issues. So, I think it's one of the transformational programs that the government has. It's one of the top priority programs, along with a lot of other things the government is talking about. This was one of the programs that the Prime Minister himself talked about in his Independence Day speech. So. I think I've talked about multiple components of it, but one of the key components, it's very close to my heart because Samir introduced me as more of a business guy than a technologist, but is that we have now actually launched an innovation effort, a local made in India software products. So we actually have the ambition to make the next Google from India. And that's good news or bad news. You'll have to decipher that. But the ambition is there, and so there's an innovation fund that has been set up, so to encourage innovation from India, and it's work in progress.
Actually, let me complete his introduction. Arvind is also the head of the ruling party's IT cell, the information technology cell, and he was also part of the hugely now successful social media and digital media campaign of the that time Prime Minister elect contender. So he is involved in many of those political activities that actually see potential in the digital medium. Aruna ji, she is actually going to try to make it happen. In a sense, how do you find some initiative as big as this?
Thank you, Samir. I think you mentioned in your opening remarks that there were a number of challenges. Certainly, I think one of the most fundamental and one of the largest challenges that India faces is simply one of access. We are still in a situation where more than 2/3 of the country lacks any kind of access. So even before we start speaking about any of the other issues, we have to address this issue. Now, one of the key points that I want to signal here is that this problem of access really exists at two levels. One is that, today we certainly have the technology and the engineering capability to address this challenge, but the issue is that we still have not begun to seriously look at it until very recently, until the Digital India program almost. We haven't really looked at it as a basic entitlement. And unless we start looking at it as a basic entitlement as a society, I don't think we will really be able to address the challenge of access. As far as the program that Samir mentioned about, to lay optic fiber or to connect every single rural panchayat in the country through broadband. It's certainly one of the largest projects of its kind anywhere in the world. And it's not just a question of actually putting in the plumbing, but the fact that it's a very interesting model. And I think Vint was mentioning to me that Australia is the one country that is, trying this model, attempting this model, where we're trying to build the basic broadband infrastructure as a nationally owned asset. And therefore, you would be able to get all kinds of platform and content providers to ride this as a neutral network. So a lot of the problems of net neutrality can actually get addressed at source if we get this thing right. Now, I want to flag here 3 challenges, and I think it's important because in addition to the issue of physical access, almost every one of us here, as Vint was saying, we look at Google 25 times a day or 250 times a day, depending on, how much work we're doing. The point is, in a country where we still have so many millions of illiterate people, what's their compass for guiding them through the internet? Do we have a Google for the illiterate people? Can Google, do something on this? Can we just have icons, maybe, which will help illiterate people to, you go into one screen, you immediately flip into a screen where you have icons and they know that this is government, this is, my water supply problem, this is my agriculture. I mean, this is just a thought, but I think it's important because we're still talking about, a few 100 million people who have access to the network and who have access to every other kind of service. Whereas here we have the most powerfully transformational tool that has been available, in recent centuries, and we are not able to actually bring it to those who need it most. Because let's face it, India has the largest number of underserved people anywhere in the world. And the biggest potential of the internet is that it can provide those services. Okay, having said that, I also want to flag this issue that we have to stop looking at people as consumers of services. Consumers first, consumers last. So every discussion, every national debate that we have on this is somehow dominated by this single question. How do we deliver services and how do we have a commercially viable model? But this is not only about that. This is about the fact that people are actors, they're agents, they're stakeholders, they're participants. They have a story to say, they want to hear what's going on, they have a right to know. Now, who is going to develop that part of the internet? And I think that these are all common challenges which go far beyond government, which in fact even go beyond national boundaries. And I think unless we have constructive and creative debates with everybody involved on how we can do this, we are not really going to realize the promise that the father of the internet has given us.
So, Vint, I'll just put it in perspective. We are, and Arvind can correct me here, we are adding roughly 6 to 7 million users every month, approximately 75 to 80 million a year. We are not pushing the same number of people from primary school to secondary school. At some point, we will have more digitally enabled people than those who will have cleared primary school in India. And it's likely to be 2019, when there will be more people who will be digitally enabled, but would not have cleared primary school. Now that's a new demography you're dealing with. How do you empower them? How do you conduct services or governance or participatory democracy with this new demography which is digitally enabled? That's one reality. Second is that unlike the West where they went fixed first and wireless later, we are going wireless first and fixed much later. In fact, maybe never. So then how do you reorganize the way you design operating systems, software, services, value-added products? And we need to rethink. So who are you creating the system for now? That's the second perspective. And the third is that the past experience. We already have close to a few million, maybe 100 million Indians who can't read or write but use the mobile phone. And they know that they have to press a sequence of buttons to get to certain services, the weather information, the market information. They are keypad literate, as one of the telecom CEO tells us. They are keypad literacy. In India has created keypad literacy. So knowledge, education, empowerment are getting deconflated. They are not necessarily the same. So how do you give skills which are not necessarily riding on traditional education and riding on traditional infrastructure, and yet you are able to leapfrog people to a different? I'm just trying to confuse you more. Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I've got 2 pages worth of notes and issues that have come up. Well, I'm going to try to respond to as much of it as I can. I feel compelled, now that you brought up IPv6, I do feel like we have to say something. If you don't know this already, the original internet design had a 32-bit address space. And when Bob Kahn and I were trying to figure this out, it was 1973. And we asked ourselves, having successfully got the ARPANET running, there were only 400 computers on the ARPANET, by the way, around that time. So we were trying to figure out how many addresses we would need for the internet. And we thought, well, first question we had was, how many networks will there be per country? And we thought maybe 2, because we figured there should be some competition. And building a national scale network was not a trivial exercise. So that was our first guess. Then we didn't know how many countries there were. And we didn't have any Google to ask, so we guessed that it was 128 because that's a power of 2, and that's what programmers think in. So we thought 256 countries, which is 8 bits of address. And then we said, how many computers will there be per network? And we thought, well, we should be generous, and we said, how about 16 million? Now remember, this is in a time when most of the computers were in fixed installations, they had air-conditioned buildings, and they served anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 people because they were time-shared. So we came up with this 32-bit address space, which actually lasted until February of 2011. And at that point, ICANN, which was responsible for doing the top-level allocation of IP address space, ran out. But it was allocating addresses to the regional internet registries, and so they had not yet run out in 2011. It's now 2015, and I think 3 of the 5 regional internet registries are out of IPv4 address space. The other 2, one of which is Saran, the Americas registry, which I chair now, will probably run out sometime this year. And Afrinic is the only one that still has any substantial v4 address space left. So around 1990 or 92 or so, the engineers who were doing the standards work panicked and thought we were about to run out very quickly then, 20 years ago. And so we went into a scramble and developed a different address format, which is called IP version 6. And it has 128 bits of address space. That's 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses. This is 340 trillion addresses. That's a number only your parliament can really appreciate, I think. So that IPv6 address space is now available. ICANN is allocating it. The regional internet registries have it available. Almost all of the equipment that's available for internet use has this capability in it. The routers have it, the mobiles have it, the laptops, desktops, and tablets have it. The operating systems have v6 as well as v4 capability. They are not interoperable because there's no way to squeeze 128 bits into 32. So we need to implement this in parallel. The community that implemented this turned it on officially and globally in June of 2012. The problem is that not all of the internet service providers have actually enabled IPv6 service. And so one thing which I would urge you to do is if you have a residential IP service provider, internet service provider, you should ask them, demand of them a date certain when you can get IPv6 service. Those of you who have government responsibilities can probably make an even louder noise by saying, we're not buying any more of your service unless it comes with both v4 and v6. That will get some attention. But we need to do that because the Internet of Things isn't going to work without having the larger address space. The mobile phones of the world are already outnumber by a factor of 2 the address space that was available in IPv4. And I don't want to bore you with things like network address translation. They are weak ways of artificially expanding the address space, and they don't address security very well. So v6 is very important to our future. You mentioned the transition of the current responsibility that ICANN has. It has a contract with the Department of Commerce to perform the functions that it does. And the Department of Commerce has announced way back last year in March that it intended to end that relationship and remove the U.S. government from the responsibility that it has had to oversee this process. And now there's lots and lots of debate about how that should be undertaken. It's my personal opinion that ICANN should have processes in place to deal with issues arising that would have been addressed by the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce role right now is de minimis. The only thing they do is to examine the proposed changes to the root zone file, the domain name root zone file, and to make sure that all the processes that are supposed to have taken place for changes to that root zone have in fact been undertaken. That's all they do. They don't demand change to be made. They don't remove anything from the root. They simply observe that the process has been carried out properly. I think internal processes within ICANN and lots of transparency should be enough to deal with that question. Interestingly enough, the other two functions, the allocation of IP address space, the Department of Commerce does not engage in that at all. The regional internet registries do it, and they all have multi-stakeholder processes for feedback with regard to practices that are undertaken in each region. And so that's already, in my view, adequately protected. It's transparent, and the users, the consumers of those addresses, have something to say about policy already. The last thing that ICANN does is to keep track of the parameters of the internet address, the internet TCP/IP protocol suite. There are tables of parameters that have to be maintained so that the implementers of the protocols will be compatible with each other. This is a purely administrative function, and it's currently being done under the oversight of the Internet Engineering Task Force. So there's already a process for dealing with that. So in my honest view, this transition should not be very controversial. It has been, but I don't see that it needs to be, as long as ICANN has processes for dealing with recourse if there's an issue arising about a decision that's made. So I'm hoping that in fact this will get sorted out before the end of September of this year when that action is supposed to be taken. Now, you mentioned root servers, and I want to make sure we distinguish between the domain name systems root servers and the general routing of the internet. There are literally hundreds of copies of root servers around the world now. Way back in history, there were only 13. There were some technical reasons for that, and it was a volunteer thing, and there weren't very many. It wasn't a very large system at the time. These root servers have been replicated, and new copies can be made and placed in the internet anywhere that it is desired. So there are already hundreds of them. So the system is, in my view, very robust. It was, however, subject to vulnerability. If someone could go in, if they could break into a root server and change things, that would have a lot of damage on the net. So in the last several years, a mechanism called Domain Name System Security Extensions has been implemented at the root zone and below. This system basically says, I will digitally sign the binding of a domain name and its internet numeric address. And that digital pair, that digital signature, can be verified by anyone that's looking up a domain name to see what its translation is in a numerical address. And you're not supposed to accept anything that doesn't check out. And so by using this cryptographic method, it's very, very hard for someone to go in and modify anything because they can't sign it. They don't have the private key that's needed to do that. That's propagating now. The routing system, not the root zone system, but the routing system, also has potential vulnerabilities where someone can announce an address space that they don't have the authority to use. This is a kind of form of hijacking of the address space. and that problem it is proposed to solve that problem, again, by using a digital signature method, so that anyone anyone that hears an announcement that you should send packets with this address to me, if you make such an announcement, anyone hearing that can check with the regional internet registry tables a digitally signed indicator saying this network is allowed to announce these addresses. And if you receive an announcement which doesn't pass this test, then you should reject it and maybe raise a red flag. So there are steps that are being taken to improve the security of the basic routing system in addition to the domain name system. And all of that's happening quite independent of this question of the Department of Commerce and the ICANN relationship. So this is just is evidence, first of all, that we understand that vulnerabilities need to be diminished, and second, that we all have a kind of a shared responsibility for improving the safety of the network. So I think that's as much as I can say about those issues at this point. I want to endorse several notions that several of you have brought up. One is the digital India idea is one which I think it grabs your attention. I mean, it's a really great term, and it tells you something about the aspirations behind the program. Made in India is the other one that I find very, very compelling. When I was asking earlier, where did the mobile phones come from, and the answer is not here, then the answer is we need to fix that answer. Make your own mobile phones. In fact, make as much as you can of the things that need to be part of the internet, including the routers, for example. In fact, it's also important to remember that there's a market outside of India, and so there's no reason why you shouldn't take advantage of that as well. I can tell you that one company that in China has grown very, very rapidly, and that's Huawei, and they serve parties outside of China, and so they are an example of the ability to grow a business on the basis of a global market. The local content comment that was made is so vital. No one is going to be interested in using the internet, even if they have the capacity to use it, if it doesn't have content in it that they care about. And so this raises several issues, one of which is language, and the other one of which is content relevant to the users. And I am a big fan of producing local content, and I guess I want to point out that this comment that Aruna made about consumers versus producers, we're seeing a really interesting phenomenon. The consumers have become producers. They're the ones that produce the YouTube videos, and they're the ones that tweet, and they're the ones that put up, documents and send emails and everything else. And so this is a really interesting phenomenon. Suddenly you're not just consuming things that other people have produced, but you're producing things as well. And so this actually creates a very interesting situation where you need to have symmetric access to the internet, because you're not only consuming, but you're also producing content. This raises one other issue, and that's language translation. We tried really hard at Google to figure out how to solve that problem. But right now, it's very dependent on a statistical method. I don't know how many of you would have followed the story of language translation, but it was an early aspiration in the computer science world. I remember being an undergraduate at Stanford University in 1961, and the computer science guys were very confident that to do language translation, all we had to do was to pour the dictionary into the computer, and it would be able to translate. So we thought, well, let's try this idea out. And we got a Russian-English dictionary, and we put it into the computer. And then we thought, okay, we should translate from English to Russian and back and see whether it works. So somebody typed in a very famous English language expression, out of sight, out of mind. And we translated it into Russian, and we translated it back, and it came back, invisible idiot. And we realized at that point that there must be more to language translation than the dictionary. So there was a lot of work to do morphological translations to try to deal with semantics. And that didn't work very well. And what actually turned out to work was a statistical method. If you had two languages and a lot of documents in both languages that purported to be the same document, if you had enough of that, you could use statistical methods to say this phrase in this language must be that phrase in this language. And so there was very, very rapid progress made where there was a body of material that had both languages available. And in some cases, you could even go through several languages. You could go from one phrase in language A to another phrase in language B to a similar phrase in language C. So we pushed very hard at Google, and others did as well. We've gone about as far as we can go using purely statistical methods. So now we're back to semantics. We're back to morphological methods, and there's a lot of work going on there. But it still depends very heavily on having a corpus of common documents in multiple languages. What I don't know, and what maybe you do know, is whether there are ample corpori in the 22 or 23 languages that are considered official in this country. And I'm setting aside all of the dialects and everything else, which makes life even more wonderfully rich and complicated for you. So I guess can we ask, are there large quantities of material in multiple languages that would allow us to use statistical methods to do this kind of translation? If not, then you're kind of faced with the European situation. And the Europeans, and I think, have generally speaking ended up using English as the common lingua franca, to make a kind of joke out of it. Yes, exactly. The French they don't think that's a joke at all. They're very unhappy about it. But they have ended up with a common language that they all have agreed to use. So you need to help me here, because I don't know enough about the situation to know which tactics might make sense. But there is no doubt in my mind that local language content is really important. The ability to deal with those languages is important. But whether or not we can do automatic translation is still an open question. It's been pretty helpful in other contexts to be able to do language searches, or searches in multiple languages, and still get answers back. One of the most convenient features of the electronic mail that Google offers is automatic recognition of language and an offer to translate. And so you can imagine I get emails from all over the place, and sometimes they show up in languages that I don't speak. And Google Translate, although it's by no means perfect and can actually be pretty funny from time to time, actually helps get the gist of what the message is. So maybe, is anybody prepared to respond to this question about language corpus and statistical methods? Arvind.
From a content digitization and availability, we have unfortunately not done a great job. We didn't have the Google Digital Library project live in India yet. And I think the project has gone, also kind of lived its life in the US. So, but very interestingly, there is more digitization of the Indian content available with the Digital Library of America project, the DLPA project, and the Hathi project in the US. But we have about 3-4% of our text and other literature available, local language, which is available in digital format. But the opportunities are huge there.
I don't know whether this is a politically incorrect question or not, but would it be at all valuable to consider a policy where students learn English plus something else, whether it's the local language or Hindi or something, so that everybody has some common basis for discourse?
That they do. Not always successful, but that's meant to happen. You are at least bilingual by the time you reach the later part of your secondary school. It's not always successful, and that's the efficiency part of it. But that's the idea.
So let me come back to Aruna's challenge, which is trying to get this incredible infrastructure in place. This word infrastructure is very attractive to me, but there's another one which I think is equally attractive, and that's ecosystem. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we think our way through the implementation of these technologies and their use. Lots of pieces have to be in place for successful use of internet technology. We need to outfit our populations, our citizens, with the capacity to use the technology. And that means it has to be self-sustaining. And so this raises a really interesting question for government policy. One of the reasons that most of the internet today is actually owned and operated by the private sector is that the private sector has been in a position to generate revenue from service. So I don't fully understand, Aruna, what the plan is. I understand and I really endorse the idea of getting the basic infrastructure in place. But is there a mechanism that will generate revenue that will help pay for the support of that infrastructure? So if you provide a wholesale access to the infrastructure built by the government, and in turn those entrepreneurs charge consumers for access to the system, can that feed back into support for maintenance of the national network?
Yes, that's absolutely the model. Yes.
Should I take a couple of more interventions and then wrap up? Because I think we have 15 or 20 minutes over the promised time. And yeah, but what we'll do is I had already got 3 nods from the audience here, and I'm using the prerogative of the chair. I'm going to go for it, and then I'm going to come back to you for a brief response, and the rest of it will be over drinks and dinner. So all of you can Vint is going to be here till 9 p.m. So you can talk to him. He'll be available. I'm going to go to 3 people now. I'm going to go to Subi. I'm going to go to Dr. Bajaj, and I'm going to go to Karuna. So 3 of you with brief interventions, and if you are really brief, then we'll go for 1 more. But let's start with 3.
Thank you, Samir. Last time I heard Vint, that was in a FICCI seminar, and next year I wrote an article, "Is the Westphalian model dead in cyberspace?" So I am not going to touch on any of those aspects because Gulshan has talked about it already. But the point I'm making on behalf of the industry, which I want to understand from you, is on data localization issue. It is a concern which is with the industry, and more so in the context of the cloud model, which is emerging now, which is around for the last 3 to 4 years, and it's a great opportunity for the Indian industry. But there are challenges which are with respect to the issues which have emerged from the European market for us, which is the data protection directive. So which is hindering global data flows, and it's a non-tariff kind of a barrier, which is impacting the industry. And now the data localization issue, our government is also talking about it, and for different reasons, law enforcement access and so on. But it's a challenge from the industry side. And this has become a bigger challenge in the context of Snowden revelations, national security issues. And again, a point which Samir talked about earlier, one of the 3 major debates in India. That is freedom of expression is one, national security conflated with issues of sovereignty and jurisdiction. So I think these are important points, and there are no answers. And I'm sure you can't answer also in terms of a policy, even if we look at overall layered architecture of security or overall internet. So I'd like to hear from you on these matters here. Thank you.
Dr. Bajaj heads the Data Security Council of India. Now I'm going to Subimal. Subimal is actually a man at large. He's spreading the cyber message around India. You're working with the Secretary General, the UNSG on.
I mean, that
Okay.
Global Commission on Internet Governance, one of the RN members. Mr. Cerf, two quick, very small questions. First is, as father of the internet, I think you have a compelling interest to see that there is justice available to all the users in all of us, millions and billions. So where do you see the attribution technology and the research and efforts around that? Because I know that's also an interest area that you have always spoken in the past. Where is that going? Because, you know, whether it's the Sony hack attack or whatever we face up here, we might end up, you know, catching the wrong persons very easily. And two, do you think that as father of the internet, it might be easier for you to get a Nobel Prize for peace rather than for physics? Thank you.
Karuna. The lawyer, Supreme Court lawyer, and she's been dealing with issues on privacy and the Information Technology Act, which some say has taken away some of the freedoms guaranteed under the written constitution. So digitally, we are more deprived than we are in the real world.
Thank you, firstly, to all of you for getting together multi-stakeholder meeting at such short notice. I think that's particularly important. On access first, actually, I think Ms. Sundrarajan's points are particularly well taken in a country like India, and efforts appreciated. One thing I wanted to ask Vint Cerf, but also everyone else, is that I hear there are technologies to have a voice-enabled internet in development. And I was kind of wondered how far that had gotten, because I think that's particularly important in a country like us, where, as Samir said so compellingly, that the number of users that we add to that are internet enabled are greater than the number of people, citizens that are literacy enabled. Also given, of course, the opportunity to learn from the internet, etc. Of course, the point that you made on language then becomes centrally important, because if you can speak English, it's less important for your internet to be voice enabled in countries like India, many countries of Africa, other illiterate people, than if it is enabled in Hindi and other widely spoken local languages. Now, the second thing I just wanted to raise, because I know that a lot of us here work in the area, is that one thing that there was a case that came up very recently where a young woman was raped in an Uber taxi. Now, one of the issues that came up, and that we who work in law in the legal sector have known for a while, is that police stations are largely not connected. So yes, we have panchayats that are not connected, but we also have police stations that are not connected. So what is the result of that? If you have an employee and you go through a police verification system, the fact that there are no police proceedings or any legal proceedings against them becomes clear, but only to the extent of the jurisdiction they're in. So if I have an employee and I ask for a police verification, he or she may get a clean certificate, but only if they have not raped in Delhi. If they have raped in Mathura or in Mizoram, that will not show up. So this is, of course, true in many areas of governance. And so I think in areas of governance also, sort of connectivity becomes that much more important. One more issue, and one issue that perhaps we won't all agree with, but I think the value of these multi-stakeholder discussions is that everyone's on the table. The litigation is currently going on in the Supreme Court, and I will likely be arguing this on January 13th onwards. However, one sees that these discussions actually have some effect. Essentially, the chapeau that governs the internet at the moment is the Internet Technology Act of 2000 and the subsequent amendments and the rules under that. We have something called Section 66A, under which if you say something that is, and I quote, annoying or inconvenient, then you can potentially go to jail for 3 years. We also have the intermediary, and this has been used. This is used, and it is used repeatedly. We also have the intermediary liability rules, which require intermediaries, and an intermediary is defined as anyone from the person who, from Facebook and Google, to a person who hosts a website, an individual who hosts a website, to the person who provides BSNL or Airtel or Vodafone that provides the lines. And essentially, if you say anything insulting, they lose their safe harbor, their protection from liability, unless that is taken down immediately. It's not entirely clear whether they are required to trawl through all of the content and take down what is insulting and so forth, or whether it is actual knowledge, which is whether somebody sends a complaint and then they're required to take down the content. The third issue that we are challenging in court is something that has come up and has had a lot of media play recently, because a number of websites were blocked. And no, because the regime is such, because Rule 16 of the website blocking rules requires all the blocking to be done in secret and without, of course, any right to appeal, because it's all in secret anyway. Websites like GitHub, Vimeo, and a number of websites were blocked. And of course, the point that Ms. Sundrarajan made is, I think is a very important point, which is that people are no longer consumers. People are also producers. So therefore, there were a large number of companies, filmmakers, etc., that had their content on these websites that were, inconvenienced. The reason was that there was apparently some ISIS content on some of these websites, but that specific content was not blocked. The entire website was blocked. This particular information was leaked, or I don't know whether it was leaked, it was obtained and put out into the public domain, and after a huge public outcry, some of the websites were unblocked. So one last issue in terms of the legal regime is something that is not as directly pertinent, but is still extremely pertinent, which is that our speech laws at the moment are, we still have sedition, for instance. Our penal code originates from British times and a colonial government which sought to suppress speech. We didn't have an interest in a democratic conversation. And so we still have, like Malaysia, like a number of other countries, we still have sedition laws, for instance. We still have, for instance, if you make a sound that offends a religion, then that's criminally liable as well. Also, the Foreign Contributions Regulations Act, by which speech made domestically, if the organization has received what is defined as a foreign contribution that is unregulated by government, that the government doesn't approve, is shut down. So these are the issues that I want to discuss, but in particular, technologies on voice-enabled internet, I would love to hear from you on that. Also legal regimes in general.
So before we come back to Vint for the final word for this evening, I think there's a one-finger intervention. Or you wanted to respond to something?
No, I just
a short response.
A very short response that part of the Digital India program is what we call voice keyboards, or what is Karuna is also talking about. And in a country like India, we do recognize that this is part of the digital literacy. I mean, people should be able to give commands over voice rather than typing, because they probably won't know how to type. So.
And Manoj, you wanted to say something?
Well, mine is something very brief. I was just curious as to the developments in China, where they're completely isolating their internet and they're developing their own operating systems, browsers, apps, etc. Now, is it possible that a country completely is able to create an autonomous internet? And if we see China, perhaps maybe Iran tomorrow, North Korea, I don't know.
Can I may respond directly to that one? Of course it's possible to go and build a completely independent network using the same protocols. In fact, we used to contemplate that, special purpose networks for doing particular things that happen to use the internet protocols that weren't connected to the public internet. And so technically speaking, you can do that. The question is, would it actually be useful to do that? And I can't speak for the Chinese, obviously, but I would note two things. One, 650 million Chinese are on the net right now, so they've invested a huge amount of money in infrastructure to make that happen. And second, one of the most important things about their GDP is that it's based on export. And so if they cut themselves off from the rest of the internet, they're going to cut themselves off from a lot of commerce that they currently depend on. This is sort of like shooting yourself in the foot. Probably not a good idea. Now, I do have to say that it is entirely possible to shut down an internet in a country. It's happened before. Egypt did it, for example. And they did it not by shutting off the internet itself, but all the underlying communications technology that supports it. Because if you don't have any communications, then you can't move packets around. Wherever this has happened, it usually doesn't go on for very long, and there's a reason for that. It's too easy to find a way to transport stuff across the border by radio, for example, or by satellite. And so an attempt to shut down the internet for any long period of time will almost certainly result in the citizens trying to find ways of getting across the border by some other means. I think it's economically unattractive to try to build a barrier to literally fragment the internet. The value of the internet has always been its connectivity, and we've said that even earlier in our discussions tonight. Connectivity is very important, not only in country, but across countries. Even in cases where, to use an earlier analogy, I'm sure you're all well aware that the telephone system had the same property, namely, if you theoretically could dial a number and get to anywhere else in the world. Even when countries were in conflict with each other, you still maintained the communication capability in the hope that that communication might allow some rapprochement. So it's my belief that trying to isolate yourself from the rest of the internet mostly does damage and doesn't do a great deal of good. That hasn't stopped people from trying to do that. Should I respond to some of these other?
Yeah, so maybe in 5 minutes?
In 5 minutes. Why does this remind me of the final exam that says, tell me all you know about the universe in 25 words or less? Okay. Let me say, first of all, that anyone who believes that there isn't any abuse on the net is wrong, and there are abuses that occur. Some of them are criminal, although not all the bad things that happen on the net are the result of a criminal activity. Some of them are just mistakes that somebody made. The best example I have of this immediately coming to mind is that somebody in Pakistan, in the government, said they didn't like something that was on YouTube, and they told the communications company to shut down YouTube in Pakistan. And so the engineers went about doing that, except that the mechanism escaped from the national networks and shut down YouTube in half of the world. And it was a mistake. I mean, they literally just made an error. And I remember we said, what are you doing? And they said, well, we were told to shut it down here. And we said, yeah, but you shut it down in half the world. And they said, oh, that was an error. We didn't mean that. And I actually believe them. And the reason I tell you this story is that it is actually easy to make mistakes like that. Configuration errors are the worst ones to deal with, and they usually have the biggest damage. So most of the worst damage on the internet is a result of the mistake that people make. I mean, we make mistakes at Google sometimes. I'll tell you about it maybe over dinner. I mean, some of them are pretty funny. On the question about national security and sovereignty and so on, one of my good friends is Bertrand de la Chapelle, who is very active in ICANN matters. He's a former diplomat and now a professor. And he likes to say that we seem to have entered into a post-Westphalian world. And some of you may remember that the Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War and established the concept of sovereignty. The internet comes along, and it basically says everything should be connected to everything. And it doesn't notice when the packets go across national boundaries. In fact, it was designed to be unaware of that, partly because when you build these networks, it's the topology of the network that counts, not the geography. So we have a situation where harms can occur, can be originated in one jurisdiction and the victim can be in another jurisdiction. And your comment about the police stations not being connected is an example of that in a domestic setting, but we have a similar situation on an international setting. So it's my belief that this technology is forcing us to think about our behavior, our national behavior in a broad international context. That things that we choose to do in country have an effect on people elsewhere. Bertrand uses the following example. He says, suppose that there is a river going between country A and country B. It flows from A to B. And let's imagine, on the basis of sovereignty, that country A decides to dump all of its pollution into the river just before it goes across to country B. And country B says, wait a minute, this is a problem for us. And country A says, we're a sovereign country and we can do whatever we want on our side of the river. Well, you could argue the legal point here, but the ethical point is that that's just wrong. And so we need to start thinking about the global effects of internet and the flow of information back and forth. We have to start taking responsibility for the things that we do that have an effect on other people outside of our jurisdiction. This notion of extraterritoriality and the expectation that a legal framework which is national in scope that should have international impact needs to be rethought. We need to start cooperating with each other. This is especially true in the case of law enforcement, where it's important to have some standardized mechanism for tracking down people who have caused trouble wherever they happen to be. So there are these multilateral assistance treaties which don't work well enough, but are the basis for this kind of international cooperation. And my view is that we should make those things work better. You asked, where's an internet going? And I think the two easy answers are it's getting faster, it's becoming more accessible over wireless communication, and it's going off the planet. So there now is in operation an interplanetary internet linking Earth and Mars and the International Space Station. It's been in operation since 2004 when the first rovers landed on Mars. So I personally, because I'm a science fiction fan, I find that pretty exciting. We're not building an interplanetary network and waiting till the aliens show up. We're using it to let our own spacecraft communicate. And in fact, I'm really interested to find out from ISRO whether the current spacecraft you have in orbit is using the international or interplanetary protocols or not. I don't know the answer to that. But if they are, that's great, because that means that spacecraft can be repurposed as a node in an interplanetary backbone when you finish the scientific part of the work. I mean, you want to take advantage of things like that. Voice-enabled internet. I have the following scenario for you to think about. This doesn't actually work yet, but it's close. Imagine that you're wearing Google Glass for a minute. Now, here's the scenario. We have a deaf sign language speaker, and we have a blind German speaker. And they're both wearing Google Glass, and they're trying to communicate. So the question is, what happens? Well, the German guy says, Guten Nachmittag, ich heiße Vint Cerf. Good afternoon, my name is Vint Cerf. Of course, the deaf guy doesn't hear any of that, but the Google Glass hears it and translates the text, or translates the words into text that you can see on the screen, on the little glass display. And so the deaf guy sees what's being said. Now, the deaf guy signs back, and of course the blind guy can't see that, but the camera in the Google Glass that the blind guy is wearing sees the signing, turns it into English, translates the English into German, and uses the bone conduction speaker in the Google Glass to speak to the German guy in German. So the two are now communicating. Now, the interesting thing about that scenario is we can actually almost do that. The part that we can't do right now is get the sign language to work, but we're working on that. So I'm really proud of Google. This year, they announced that accessibility is going to be a major push for all of our products and services, and I'm very excited about that. I'm hearing impaired. I'm half deaf, and so I've been pushing really hard for things like that to happen at Google. Voice capacity is really wonderful, and I think would be very helpful for the illiterate people to make useful access to the network as well. But again, that's going to depend on language recognition and local content in language. Let's see. Oh, the Nobel Prize problem. I investigated this, and it turns out that Mr. Nobel's wife ran away with a mathematician. And he was a very good mathematician. And so Alfred Nobel said, none of my money can go to any branch of mathematics. And unfortunately, computer science is considered to be a branch of mathematics in many academic settings. And so the Nobel Prize is not available to people in my discipline. But there is a next best thing. It's called the Turing Award, and it's offered by an organization called the Association for Computing Machinery. This year, Google announced that it's a supporter of that prize. The prize is going to $1 million. Google is supporting that on an annual basis, and so the 2015 Turing Award winner will be receiving a $1 million prize, which is getting closer to Nobel Prize level capacity. So that's pretty exciting. The other thing I wanted to mention about the Association for Computing Machinery is that we have an Indian council now for ACM. They've been very active. I've been very impressed. P.J. Narayanan, who is the president of the Indian Institute for Information Technology, is former chairman of that. Was had a major hand in creating that council. So I'm wearing a bunch of different hats right now in speaking to you because I'm the former president of ACM, in addition to my other roles. So that's what the Nobel Prize is all about. I think, intermediary liability. Can I offer a kind of mind picture for you for a second? I want you to think about the search engine and what it does. It's like a mirror because it's reflecting the content of the network. Google and the other search engine providers are simply showing what's out there. They're not generating it, they're showing what's out there. Now, if you don't like what you see in the mirror, fixing the mirror doesn't do any good. You have to fix what's reflected in the mirror. So going after the intermediaries feels like fixing the mirror. What you should be doing, I think, is going after the people that put the content up on the net in the first place. Now, it's true you have to figure out where they are, and I know that's not a trivial exercise, but we should be really thoughtful about the rules that we try to develop and engage and execute, because sometimes it's like trying to fix things by just fixing their reflection, and that isn't getting at the heart of the problem. So my view is that we should be fixing the real problems, not the ones that are in the mirror. I think that's surely enough for now, don't you think? All right.
Thank you very much.